So only with women. So I don't know if I'm terribly lucky or terribly unlucky, but anyway.
He will tell us something about FIDOL factors, which you have already heard before in this workshop, and some concept of Odour nuisance.
Thank you, Laura. I try to be as speed as possible to save some time. Anyway, I'm here, yes, talking about the FIDOL factors and trying to understand a little better what is the Odour nuisance and not only the odor itself. The problem, okay. Why we should study the Odour nuisance is almost a well-known problem, at least in this room, because it causes health problems due to the nuisance itself, like anxiety, vomiting, nausea, and something like that. Due to decreasing of the values of the houses and the terrains, and of course the public complaints that could cause a lot of problem as a social and industrial. There are a lot of ways to assess the odor and the characteristics of an odor and of an emission, or anyway, we can measure an odor with the dynamic olfactometry that at least now we almost know totally, completely well, in odor units per cubic meter. But usually when we talk about emissions, we deal with the odor emission rate, because what we have to understand to assess if an odor can cause a nuisance around the emission is how much odor is emitted, and not exactly how strong is the odor in only one point, like in the emission. And there are also other parameters, like odor emission factors, which are used to represent the amount of odor, in this case measured in odor units, which are normally correlated to an amount of materials which is produced or worked or treated in a particular facility, in a particular industry. But do all these stuffs help us to define the odor nuisance or not? Probably not, because in these cases we are only talking about the odor itself. So what should we do? First of all, we have to understand all the chain which causes the odor, and then also its own nuisance. So we can start from the formation during a chemical, biological, I don't know, process. Probably there is the possibility of formation of smell molecules. What does it mean? That there is a molecule which has a low odor threshold, so it's possible to perceive it by olfaction. After the formation, usually to arrive to the destination to assess the odor noise, to produce an odor nuisance, this molecule has to pass through air, of course, because when we think about an odor, we need to relate to a gaseous mixture. Anyway, after the passing to the air, there is probably an atmospheric release. As an example, the classical chimney in an industry. After the release, there is the famous dispersion. We have talked so much about the atmospheric dispersion models, but anyway, in which way we can and we want to assess the dispersion happens somewhere and some way. So of course, this odorant goes around in the area nearby the emission. Usually, when we are talking about nuisance, there is also some receptors around the emission point. So the next step is the presence of a receptor which feel the odor which is emitted from the plant, which can understand something about this emission and perceive something about what usually perceive a receptor. Usually it perceives a frequency of exposure, because of course a person can feel, can smell an emission often or hardly ever. Of course it can feel a strong smell or maybe a light smell. It can feel the smell for a long time, for some hours for example, or maybe only for some minutes. And of course there is also a dependence from the emission and from the molecules that are emitted and are perceived. The quality of the smell, of course, but is trivial to understand that. After the exposition, there is also something like an internal procedure, a neural procedure of elaboration by the receptor, because of course we talk a little bit about the fact that olfaction borns in the humans as a defensive sense. So of course different type of odor can cause different types of elaboration of answer from my brain and my body. And my feeling, my answer to the smell depends also by who I am, because if I'm sick, if I'm okay with my body, if I'm young, if I'm old, if I'm a man, a woman, anyway there are a lot of parameters. But anyway, usually when there is these events, if I do not want to feel an odor and then anyway I feel it, there is an annoyance to myself, which can have different characteristics, and if the annoyance is repeated along the time, we are used to talk about the nuisance, a true nuisance, a situation in which I feel terribly disturbed, and I think about that not only when I feel the annoyance and when I smell an odor, but also in other periods, because of course maybe when I have to come back at home after work, I think, oh come on, I have to come back home, but I do not want to, because surely there will be this odor and blah blah blah. And anyway, if the nuisance is perceived by a lot of people, usually the end point is an official complaint action by the population to a plant or to the government or regional agencies. We've talked about the different odors. These are some emission factors from literature, which almost was put here to say, even if there are maybe emission correlated to the quantity of production from which are similar, as in this case the chocolate factor and the rendering process. Do you know, somebody don't know what is a rendering plant? A rendering plant is a very funny plant because it tasty. Yes, is a place where you should go
not
visit.
after having had breakfast.
Yeah, because it's the place where the body of dead and sick animals are treated. So you can imagine the wonderful perfume that you can feel there. But anyway, the amount of odor is similar between a chocolate factory and a rendering plant, but of course we can imagine that the nuisance related could be a little bit different. Usually, and for these days we have talked so much about the odor, but we can understand that it's different from another nuisance, because this is a perception, maybe also a convention, this is a feeling. And how can we link these stuffs with, theoretically, we should use psychometrics. Psychometrics is a mixture of psychology and science, and a different branch of the science. We try to relate different stuff linked to the human feelings. Anyway, what we should do for solve this problem is not, as you can imagine, an easy task. Anyway, what is usually used to consider, and which are all the features that another nuisance could have, are all these 5 FIDOL factors. FIDOL because of the first letter of them. The first one is the frequency of an odor, because if I'm often exposed to an odor, of course, probably I'll feel more molested, si può dire? Annoyed by these events. There is also, of course, the intensity, because it's worse to feel a strong odor than a light odor. There is the duration, because if I'm exposed every day to an odor, probably I feel more annoyed. And of course, there is also the offensiveness, because if we are talking about rendering, or if we are talking about chocolate, maybe something, it will be different. And there is also the location, because it's not only all the other parameters, but it's also important where a person feel another annoyance or nuisance. So let's analyze a little bit all of them. So frequency is, of course, how often an individual is exposed to an odor. The frequency of exposition usually is related to the method of the emission, and also to the geometry and to the physics of an emission. And there are a lot of ways to understand and to assess and to calculate the frequency of the exposure. But usually the jurisdictions, like it was said before, fix a limit of the concentration at the receptor, usually evaluated with dispersion models, but has a tendency to find a target frequency. First, before Carlos expressed it very well as the total amount of the odor, or the total amount of the hour which are considered in a whole year, as for example the 98th percentile, because I focus stupidly still on the percentiles, represent the fact that it's considered that for the 98% of the hours in a year, you should not smell something in your home, or anyway when the receptor, where the receptor is. The 98% means in a year, o meglio, the 2% of in a year represents 175 hours in the whole year. So it is the meaning of the percentile. I don't know if I was clear. I hope so. Anyway, we can talk about in a second coffee break. The intensity is a very difficult task to give a number for the intensity, because there is a VDE which says how to assess the intensity from 0 to 6, but usually it's considered to be correlated, even if it's not perfect, with the odor concentration as assessed by dynamic olfactometry. So we can imagine a correlation between intensity and the odor concentration. that a person smell. As I say, there is also a VDE which propose a way to assess the odor intensity, but usually a lot of jurisdiction propose an odor concentration limit which should represent the intensity of an odor perceived at the receptor. Prego, please.
You know why I of intensity is there, right?
Why? Sorry?
Why the I in FIDOL is there? Because it's nothing to do with intensity. It's there because you can pronounce FIDOL. Because in the whole countries you use concentration, not intensity, which is not the same. And if you put concentration, you should say stop. That's why it's FIDOL. But there is no intensity. There is no intensity. Nobody uses intensity.
Yes.
Nobody.
Yeah, usually not.
No.
But
no, in the legislations you will never find
in legislation, yes, yes, but normally there is no one legislation which consider all the FIDOL factor precisely as I know, right?
Yeah.
So it was only a theoretical description of the parameters which can affect the odor nuisance perceived by a receptor.
It's just
But
that
I think it's exactly what he was saying, that you can, in fact,
try to.
it's the concentration that you consider, not the
Well,
intensity.
which is another totally
Yeah.
different thing.
Yeah,
Yes.
normally yes. Also, this is a very good paper which talk a lot about all these parameters. So if you are more interested in all these stuff, you can read it. The duration is about, of course, how much time I perceive an odor, because if I feel an odor for a lot of hours, it's worse that I feel only for 10 seconds in a whole year. Also, the duration is related and is some way considered in the legislation, because usually, for example, the laws say to assess the 98th percentile of the odor concentration at the receptor with an atmospheric dispersion model, but with an averaging time of 1 hour. So some way is considered also the duration of the odor perception at the receptor. There are also a lot of correlation to academic and theoretical correlation to relate the concentration in an hour to the possible peaks that the concentration could have inside the hour for a shorter period of time. But these are quite difficult stuff, we're talking about meteorology and all this stuff. Anyway, duration is easy to understand that it can affect the nuisance, and some ways is already considered in the legislation due, for example, with the peak to mean ratio factors. Blah 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 blah. Offensiveness, of course, there is an important factor for the motivation that we talk about. There is also for the hedonic tone a way to assess it and give a number, and usually the scale is also for the VDI the scale is bipolar, so it goes from -4 for the worst smell that you can feel, and it goes to +4 to represent the best smell that you can feel. These are examples reported in an English document about the hedonic tone of different kind of odors. Andiamo in fretta. Location. The nuisance perceived by a receptor is linked to the location, usually at least in 2 ways. One, who I am and how much I'm sensitive to another nuisance. Of course, if I am a well-being man, young and with no problems, probably I can also accept an odor nuisance, but maybe if I am a pregnant woman, I am more sensitive to all these kind of problems. So there is this parameter which can affect the odor nuisance, but also there is also the expectation that I have about the place where I am. Of course, if I am in a farmland use, if I smell something about the pigs or cows or anyway cattle, I'm not so disturbed than if I am in Duomo Square here in Milan and I feel a pig smell or something like that. So there is also the expectation which affect the odor nuisance. These are some example of limits, quite old, reported in the publication that I quoted about before. As you can see, they are very different. They are very different as a concentration, as a representative of intensity, and also about the frequency, because of the percentile which is considered, and also to the duration, because the averaging time which is considered represents some way the duration of the other events at the receptors. So, usually the method considers the atmospheric dispersion model, blah 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 blah. But I guess that I can stop here because time is finished. So if I have question, I'm here.
The next speaker is Pierluigi Barbieri from the University of Trieste. Thank